It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Al Ortiz, who will speak to us about the future of news. Al has been at CBS News for 43 years, starting in radio. He worked for CBS Evening News as a producer, senior producer, and eventually as executive producer. He was foreign editor, then London bureau chief during the fall of communism and the first Persian Gulf War. Then Washington bureau chief. He was executive producer of special events from 2000 to 2013, producing coverage of the disputed 2000 election, the attack on 9/11, the invasion of Iraq, and coverage of primaries and elections up through 2020. Since 2014, Al has also been CBS's vice president for standards and practices. Prior to working for CBS, Al worked for 3 years for Voice of America as a Latin America correspondent. He was based in Buenos Aires and was in Panama City. Al is also, coincidentally, my brother-in-law. Al, welcome and thank you for speaking to the Cambridge Club.
Thanks, Kathy. It's quite an honor to be asked to appear before the Cambridge Club. I'm really honored to be speaking with you all. And although thanks for that introduction, Kathy, I should probably point out to people that my first job out of college, because I couldn't get a job in journalism, was as a grave digger. So I dug graves for a couple of years, and that started my storytelling adventures. I wanted to talk a little bit about the changes that we see in the news business that are happening right in front of us, and that are and what a number of big stories tell us about what is to come, in terms of the technology that's available, the news that we have available to bring to you, and the power that you all have in as news consumers in selecting and affecting the news that that is out there that you can turn to. I'd like to focus on 4 major stories that have dominated the news over the past year and see what what these stories tell us. They have direct impact on our lives, and they tell us a lot about the future of news. The stories I want to focus on are COVID, the death of George Floyd and the trial of Derek Chauvin, climate change, and the January 6th assault on the Capitol in Washington. They all may seem unrelated, but they point to where we're going in terms of the work that we do. The COVID coverage has been the most intense and comprehensive coverage of a pandemic the world has ever known. There's no public health story that comes close to it. Our first challenge in reporting on COVID was sorting through all the information and data which started pouring in, educating ourselves and our audiences on what was reliable information, which experts to listen to, how reliable was the information coming out of federal and state agencies? Was the White House downplaying the threat? Who in the White House should we be listening to? Next was the public health mitigation efforts. Were they being effective? The masks, the social distancing, were the shutdowns necessary? Were the shutdowns helping? It took months to find answers to these questions. And all the time, people were dying and getting sick in frightening numbers. And it was affecting every aspect of our lives in ways that we hadn't seen before. The entire country and the news media went on a crash course to educate ourselves about all these public health issues. We faced a common threat, a common existential threat, requiring, one would think, a common, united, coordinated response. But is that what we did? No. What happened was the response to this common threat became highly politicized, and this sets a precedent for the future, an ominous one. Over the past year, huge amounts of personal data from COVID testing, hospital records, medical examiners across the country, polling, all this massive new data about us was assembled by the government and made available to health authorities, the pharmaceutical industry, even to the news media. We don't know yet how all that data is going to come to be used by businesses, by political organizations, for example. But I can assure you that the government and big data companies have access to and can find out more about individuals than ever before. And all this because personal data is traded, sold and bought, just like any other commodity. It will enable companies to target many medical and many other commercial products to selected individuals. Political organizations will be able to target their messages at a more granular level. News organizations will be able to target their products to what the research shows are specific groups of people and what they're really interested in. Meanwhile, the politicization of the pandemic, questions like, what's the virus doing now? Should we continue to wear masks? Should we open the economy faster? Are the vaccines safe? All of these are increasingly viewed through the lens of politics. Blue states versus red states. Who should be helped economically by the government? Red states versus blue states. And nearly lost in all this noise is, what is the science telling us? Another troublesome indicator for the future. For the coming years, possibly decades, all of us, and we in news, will be on tenterhooks, vigilant for mutations and variations in viruses that threaten to break out and cause sudden major loss of life. Remember the SARS virus? Remember the bird flu, the Zika virus? These occur more often than we generally like to think, and this one caught us quite by surprise. The second story that indicates where we're going and what will dominate news in the future was the death of George Floyd and the trial of Derek Chauvin. It was all made possible because one teenage girl, Darnella Frazier, had the presence of mind to turn on her cell phone and record the entire event. From when Officer Chauvin had just placed his knee on George Floyd's neck until Mr. Floyd's lifeless body was lifted up, put on a stretcher and into an ambulance. Now, cell phones have become ubiquitous, and on any given day, you can see videos of police encounters with civilians, peaceful, violent, deadly, and everything in between. It's given strength to the Black Lives Matter movement because we're seeing recordings of many of these encounters, which until recent years were not much seen by the public. Police departments have distributed body cams to officers, but those videos can be jittery. They depend on the police officers to start them, and often they are not promptly released to the public by the authorities. One of the earliest of these recordings, the 1991 police beating of Rodney King in Los Angeles, was captured by a bystander on videotape. But the poor quality of the recording and the interruptions and breaks in the recording were assailed by the defense and gave the defense enough room to raise questions and doubts about what might have happened during the breaks in the video sequence. The brilliance of Darnella Frazier was that she recorded the entire George Floyd incident without stopping. No breaks in the action, no openings to raise doubts about what the camera might have missed. And thus the 11-minute recording became the incontrovertible piece of evidence at the Derek Chauvin trial. It was not challenged or questioned by the defense. There were other videos taken by bystanders of the event, taken of bystanders and by police body cameras, but nothing was as unassailable as the Frazier video. Future controversial or violent encounters of police with citizens will be recorded because citizens now know what a powerful tool the cell phone can be in the pursuit of justice. We have entered a new era where there will be far fewer of these incidents that are hidden, with no video record, where it's just the police's word against the word of a citizen of any color or race. You're already seeing several of these stories each week on the networks, on local television, and of course on the internet. This will continue to drive the debate over police reform, the proper use of force, and what is the proper relation between police and minorities, between police and all citizens. My third indicator of where the news is going is climate change. Here's the headline. Climate change is going to make the COVID pandemic look like a flash in the pan. Climate change is the news beat of the future. Like COVID, climate change will affect every aspect of our lives. It's already started. The news is saturated with coverage of extreme weather. We've already passed the point where the Earth's temperature will rise enough to melt most glaciers, alter weather patterns, which will in turn change where people can live, where they can produce their food, where they can insure their houses, how they get their energy. And most of it is probably not reversible. The most we can hope for is to mitigate the effects, adapt to the effects, lower carbon and methane emissions as much as we can, and develop new technologies to survive. We're all going to have to educate ourselves about climate science and how we respond to this. We have no choice. We're bringing our children into a more inhospitable environment. And how do we keep large parts of the earth from becoming uninhabitable? You all and the news media have to learn about this. We need to turn to news sources that pay attention to this. Organizations like CBS News, NBC News, Times of India, The Guardian, the BBC, CNN are all part of international news consortiums that are pooling our resources now in an unprecedented effort to inform the world that action must happen now to avoid the worst scenarios of global warming. Some of those worst scenarios are truly unthinkable. So what are we leaving our grandchildren? Like COVID, this entire subject has become politicized in this country. And as in the case of COVID, the news media and news consumers have a responsibility to seek out science as we go forward. My fourth indicator of where the future of news lies is in the coverage of the January 6th assault on the Capitol. I cannot think of another recent event quite like it. There we were putting out hours and hours of live coverage. And in the moment, we could not fully grasp what was really going on behind the front lines. We weren't sure what this really was. We weren't even sure what to call it. Was it a riot? Was it a terrorist attack, an insurrection, an attempted coup? As the days went by after the incident, we learned that the violence and threats were far worse than we first thought. Video emerged of Vice President Pence and congressional leaders fleeing for their lives along secret escape routes. Unspeakable acts of courage by Capitol Police risking their own lives to deflect rioters and save senators and members of Congress. The erection of a symbolic, perhaps, gallows on the steps of the Capitol for the hanging of congressional leaders and the vice president. It took days, weeks to go through all the video recorded that afternoon to fully comprehend the extent of the violence and the hateful threats. Now, more than 4 months after the attack, law enforcement has used news footage that was aired that day and online video taken by the rioters themselves to identify and charge more than 400 suspects in that insurrection. Nothing, of course, could be more politicized than this event, but it was not politicized by the news media. The massively huge video records that exist online are a new source of information for law enforcement and for journalists. And this is a model of how these records will be mined in the future to probe into complex and confusing news events. I'd like to say a word about misinformation and the big lie. There's always been misinformation and disinformation. Journalism was invented to counter misinformation and disinformation. Often in history, the twisting of the truth has come from governments. And that's why our founders made the First Amendment. Oh, but this country's so divided now more than ever before. This country's been plenty divided before, most notably leading up to, during, and after the Civil War. And we're still dealing with the ramifications of all that, especially the racial oppression. But the refusal to accept the results of an election poses some particular challenges and threats to a democracy. We in the news business have not yet found, and I doubt that we will ever find, real evidence of widespread voter fraud in the last election. Our recent polling has found that nearly 7 out of 10 voters who call themselves Republicans they tell us that they do not believe that Joe Biden won the election. Think about that for a moment. A significant part of the country maintains that we are being governed by an illegitimately installed president. And some believe that the previous president was right to try to interrupt and overthrow the democratic process of counting the results of the Electoral College. It became a refusal to accept defeat at the ballot box. And from that comes a refusal to accept compromise, a refusal to respect and accept the views and the legitimacy of your fellow citizens who don't agree with you. And right now, state legislatures and governors are hard at work, restricting the ability of their political opponents to vote in the future. They're doing this by trying to restrict access to the ballot box. And journalists are judged by whose side they appear to be on. The pursuit of facts and the truth will always be the future role of journalism. It's true whether we're reporting on a COVID pandemic, the causes of global warming and climate change, racial justice, or political struggle. The future of news depends on earning and keeping your trust that we are doing our level best to verify what we're showing you and reporting to you, and that we're fairly representing the diversity of views that always exists in this country on the issues of the day. What can you do to affect the future of news? Well, the news media, like any other large media industry, tracks what you're following, in no small part for commercial reasons. You are the consumer, you have the power of choice, and your choices affect and help determine which news sources are available to you. Choices you have and recommendations that I have are, number one, vary your news diet. Don't depend on just one source of information for your news. I'd love to tell you all, watch CBS News and only CBS News, but I don't recommend that. You vary your food diet, your financial investments, your reading, your life. You should vary your news diet. Don't get it all from one source. Secondly, select at least one wide spectrum news provider. What is a wide spectrum news provider? Well, CBS News is one. We survive by trying to reach the most number of viewers, audience members, listeners, and readers in the country. We don't try to cater to one side or to one niche. There are a number of large-scale, wide spectrum news providers, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, other networks. My suggestion is try different wide spectrum news providers, but they deliberately seek out ways to report multiple points of view and to not cater to one particular niche. Third, I suggest that you venture beyond your comfort zone when you're looking for news. See how other people think, see how other societies think, see how other countries think. One of the effects of the last 8 years of putting America first, and really America only in some cases, is that we've become a very inward-looking country. And this is reflected in the news that's brought to you. You'll find that the amount of space, the amount of airtime given to foreign news coverage in newspapers, on networks, on cable networks, has really declined over the last 8 years. And that's because we're much more inward looking. And it's dangerous because we live in the world, we can't avoid it. All of these problems that I'm raising, they have issues that are bouncing around the world, and we need to be aware of them. And my fourth recommendation is that when science is involved in a story, such as the pandemic, global warming, seek out the science. It's really important to listen to the experts in the field, not to deny the science, but to learn about it, educate ourselves on it, and trust those news providers that are bringing that information to you. I'd like to leave you with just a final thought on these prepared remarks, and that is, we've never had as many news sources as we have now, as news providers. That means that we've never had as much good information or bad information as we have now. But the principal news providers, organizations like CBS News, organizations like ABC, NBC News, and the major newspapers and the wire services, these are all, they're trying much more than they ever have to make sure that we harvest all points of view and all sides in the discussion. One of you asked me before we started this session, what about organizations like Facebook and social media? Social media is great for turning everyone into a publisher, but it doesn't turn people into editors. And you need to know that a news organization like CBS News does its best to try to seek out check out the authenticity of the information and the pictures that we send to you. In our polling, we try to do it as scientifically as possible. And there's a huge difference between what Facebook does and what we do. We can't take any action to guarantee that people are putting out misleading information, but we can check out that the information that we're putting out is responsible and is well sourced and is balanced and is fair. And you have the choice of choosing us over that. So use the principal news providers is my recommendation. And I'll take your questions now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Al. As I prepped you before this meeting, this group has a lot of good questions and insights. And members, I see a question from Mary Catherine Diebel. And also, if you put your questions in the chat, I'll call on you. Mary Catherine.
Mute. Of course, I'm muted. Thank you very much for that. It was lots of food for thought. What do you say to people who say that, you know, that the main news outlets like ABC, NBC, I think especially of NBC, which I watch a lot, and ABC, are by their, you know, have proven to be sort of leftist or at least Democratic leaning, and much as they try not to be, they are generally, I mean, the staffing is generally on both coasts, which are pretty liberal leaning. Most of the people who do it don't believe in conspiracy theories and the fact that the election was a fraud. And also what I noticed is that lots and lots of stories on social equity, Black Lives Matter, in a very presented completely in a positive way, etc. And what do you say to that? Do you think that's when you say that you present things, you make, you know, you try very hard to present both sides? Do you think that that is really what happens, or do you think it is relatively aimed at and geared toward and influenced by the fact that it is Democratic leaning, or you know, leans to the left at least a little bit?
Well, we all have our personal points of view, and one of the challenges in journalism is to work beyond that, to see beyond that, and to not just try to have not go into this trying to have your own personal points of view ratified. I think it's important for large news organizations to recruit from a wide base, to have a lot of voices at the table. We have a lot of diversity at CBS News. We don't question people about their political beliefs before we hire them, but we expect to have conservative commentators. We expect to have people expressing conservative assessments of what's going on right now. I don't think it's liberal to say that there's no evidence of widespread fraud in the last election. There simply isn't any evidence of widespread fraud in the last election. We haven't found it. We've looked for it. We've had investigative teams working on this stuff. And just because you're reporting what you found or haven't found, I don't think makes you compromised in terms of having a bias. I think that we've gone out of our way to try to be fair about in our political coverage about what's happened in the last election, but also try to be fair in other areas. I mean, I mentioned climate change and COVID, and we've we've tried to incorporate in our coverage the points of view of those who feel that the government was getting too much in people's lives, that the government was being too intrusive, that we were undermining the economy by listening to the science side of things. What I think, I don't think that we can avoid being criticized for having an approach that is not wedded to one side or the other. I just believe that we're truly you have to truly listen to the opinions and the voices of other people that you don't agree with, and hopefully in the end you come out with something that's fair once you've applied your editorial discretion to determine what's accurate and what isn't accurate. But I do think that a lot of news organizations can help themselves by recruiting from a diverse platform, so you have a diversity of voices at the editorial table. That's different from, say, Fox News, which made a deliberate commercial attempt commercial move to ensure its survivability by appealing to one side of the political spectrum and one side only. And that's why I recommend that you look at a wide spectrum news provider.
Thank you so much, Al. And thank you, members, because you have many, many good questions coming in. Kristen, do you want to ask the next question?
Yeah, thank you very much for speaking with us. And I looked a little bit into some of your history and work, and I'm intrigued and daunted by how does one depoliticize the environmental issues? Now, we do know that had we had another president, probably COVID would not have become so political. But once we have people feeling like it's a matter of putting in something in legislation, or what can people do? Who can, and what can CBS do to make it less political an issue?
Well, I'm probably going to repeat what I said a little earlier, and that is we really try to base our coverage on the science as much as possible. By the way, the rest of the world has sort of gone beyond the political discussion on the environment. You don't find it so much in Europe. You don't find it in the third world. You don't find it in places like India. It's really more in this country that that you still have a discussion about whether methane and carbon is causing what's happening. There's really no question that methane and carbon are causing what's happening. How the process and what industries are feeding it, and what's more of a factor. Those are discussions that are constantly going on. And what do you do about it? At the recent climate summit, Russia and China took the position that the way out of the climate crisis was to increase production. And these are two economies that are highly dependent on mining, on fossil fuels, and to get them to realize that their fate is tied up in this is a real challenge. But in this country, I think that the best thing we can do, and this is why I recommend that, we all have to educate ourselves on this.
Yeah.
The results are happening every year. Every year we're reporting on something we've never seen before. The tidal basin in Washington is disappearing in front of our eyes because it's flooding out. The islands in the Pacific and the Caribbean that are in danger of being below sea level in a matter of decades. The changing patterns of tornadoes and storm patterns in this country. And you know, the story of the migration coming up from South America is deeply rooted in environmental consequences. These a lot of reasons. One of the reasons that so many people are leaving their homes in Central America and coming north is because of the failure of their agriculture. The rain cycles have totally messed up the coffee industry in Central America. There are no other ways for people to make a living in some of these places. So we're seeing the effects of this, and they're just going to increase. I think when you start seeing it affect people in commercial ways, that has a new and special impact. For example, it is now really difficult to insure property in large parts of California because of the fire threat. It will soon be very difficult to insure seafront property in Florida. And what do you do with that? I mean, suddenly property becomes worthless if you can't insure it. So that has a tremendous effect on the economy and on business institutions. And it's interesting to me that one of the most forward-looking industries in this country in terms of environmental science and its effects are the banks and investment companies that see it coming. They do look 20, 30 years out. And I've been trying to get more of those voices into our coverage because they're very realistic about, look, we're going to have to figure out ways that right now we can't afford to mitigate some of these effects. And people are going to have to, raise food in different areas. They're going to have to migrate and move to different areas, and things that we've been used to in our lifetime just aren't going to be doable in 60, 70 years.
Thank you.
Thank you, Al. We have about 7 other questions. So let's go.
Good.
Bob Simha has asked, what do you think about the demise of the old fairness principle and its impact on current news providers?
Well, the fairness principle has been pretty much gone by the wayside in terms of any enforcement by the FCC. It's now honored more in the breach by the news media themselves, the larger organizations, and it really comes into play during election cycles, where if we're giving one candidate an excessive amount of coverage or airtime, or you're covering one side in terms of your live appearances and live coverage, how you balance that out so that you're not favoring one side over the other. The place where all this sort of fell apart, I would say, was during Donald Trump's first election campaign, where what you were seeing on those live events was so unusual that mostly the cables and online news agencies would cover his events to the exclusion of other events. And there's really no government penalty for that. There's no way to enforce that. We basically operate under the notion that in an election cycle, if we're going to cover one side, one side's events, we got to be fair and cover the others. You cover 4 nights of the Republican convention, you cover 4 nights of the Democratic convention. You put on ads, you buy ads that are attack ads from both sides. You can't just buy them from one side. That's sort of, and we observe that really because we want to maintain our reputation as being as even-handed as we can, not because we're afraid the government's going to come and take our license away. Our government can come and take away our license away for many other reasons, but they generally won't do it over matters of fairness. There's really no way to enforce fairness. It's just, I think it's a term that I grew up with, and it got it was talked about a lot in, I'd say, the mid part of the last century when we were in election cycles. And we observe it for our own traditions and reputation and the respect that we want to show to a wide spectrum audience again. But there's really very little government enforcement of fairness. Now, when Facebook or Mark Zuckerberg decide that they're not going to, they shouldn't be the arbiters of free speech. That's their position. But when the tweets went out from Trump's side about the revolt and the insurrection on January 6th, it was the social media companies themselves responding to popular social pressure that took action to rein in some of that, and created, this board that's supposed to rule on whether Donald Trump can have access to his Facebook account again. And the government has no role in that. I'm not sure the government should have a role in that, but our business is a little different from theirs in the sense that we have to exercise our own balance of fairness, and but the fairness doctrine itself is something that I think really, I think since the late 1900s has just not been enforced or pushed by the government.
Thank you, Al. George, do you want to give your question?
Sure. You said, and I appreciate that we should be varying our news diet and that we should seek out wide spectrum news providers. And I get that that's good for me as a news consumer, but I'm wondering, in making those choices about what I look at and what sources I go to, am I exercising any market forces in terms of what the market supports in terms of one news source over another that may not be responsible, may not be authentic, may not be open sourced?
Well, our businesses, our news businesses are all parts of larger companies and corporations, and we unfortunately all have to make some kind of a profit in order to stay in existence. That's determined by our commercial revenues, and that's the size of our audience and how well we keep our audience, and how well we grow our audience. One of the brilliant moves of the people who created Fox was that they thought that they could just, if they tailored their coverage to one sliver or one side of the political conversation, that there was enough there that they would stand out on their own to be commercially viable. And it's turned out to be a good bet for them. They are commercially viable, and they stayed commercially viable by pretty much telling a part of the country what they want to hear. And that's one way of doing it. The reason they do it is because people choose them, people watch them, people watch their advertising, and that's how they're supported. We have always taken a different approach, which is to try to get as many eyeballs, as many viewers and audience members from across the country. And that requires a different approach. That requires something where you're looking at different points of view, you're looking at different parts of the country, you're trying to be fair and not catering to one particular view. The reason I mention this to you is because, yes, you do, I think enough people decide to watch news that's more wide spectrum and more inclusive, I think those organizations and those news providers become more commercially viable. The more we stray to the extremes, the fewer of the inclusive, middle of the road, mainstream news organizations you're going to have, because they won't be as commercially viable.
Yeah.
So yes, your habits, enough people's habits taken together, do have an effect on what's viable and what's available to you. And what I'm telling you is that data of who's watching, what they're watching, how long they're watching, and what they switch to is all available now, and is used, and it's being mined to make decisions of what kind of news we should be putting on the air.
Al, isn't the evening news, so CBS is part of Viacom now, so a lot of the news is actually paid for by sporting events and other types of events, right?
But that's not new. That's been the case for a long time. I mean, CBS News, when it was a standalone CBS Corporation, when it was a standalone corporation, I'll let you into a little bit of our financial world here. We've always looked to events like sporting events as an important revenue source. And there's sort of a formula to it. You know what you're going to pay for rights. You know how much it's going to cost you to produce the game. You don't know what the outcome is going to be, but you know what the costs are, and you know roughly what to expect in the way of audience. So you know what to charge for ad revenue. It's a fairly predictable formula. News is a far more imprecise thing and unpredictable. And it's harder to plan out where your ratings are going to go, or what's going to be most profitable. I'll tell you, for CBS News, don't laugh, but we make most of our money on Sundays. 60 Minutes, which is a consistently #1 program, is a highly profitable show. It costs a lot to advertise on 60 Minutes. Sunday Morning, which is a very popular show, there's quite nothing else quite like it on the air, really. It's 90 minutes of all the stories that you want to see, not stuff that you have to watch. And it's a wonderful recipe for the soul on a Sunday morning. And then all of the Sunday talk shows, Meet the Press, Face the Nation, which is our show, the ABC Sunday Talk Show, all of those Sunday talk shows are, if you look at the ads, they're all big companies, big spenders. Those shows all make a lot of money. And then you add to that our sports programming on Sundays. We basically make most of our money on Sundays. The rest of the time, I mean, the morning shows during the week are profitable. And at NBC, it's highly profitable because they have the most popular shows, with the Today Show, and ABC's evening news is #1. Those are highly profitable. But for example, in the case of CBS, not everything makes a ton of money. Most of our revenue is the bedrock of it is our Sunday programming. So you have to plan it, you know, what your budgets are and what you can afford to cover accordingly. Foreign news is really expensive to cover. That's why you don't see as much of it as you used to. Election night programming is really, really expensive to mount. And all of the machinery that comes with that, the polling, the surveys, the projections, the ability to make projections on races and to get it right. That's not only difficult, it's very expensive. And you find that the advertising revenues for those things are higher, the rates are higher, but those are the things that we really try to try to capitalize on a little bit. NBC makes a huge amount of money on Olympics, and they've tied up the Olympics rights for, I don't know, the next 10, 20 years. But that's all part of the programming, and those profits that I'm talking about are used to support everybody's news gathering work, which is not so profitable. To go to India to cover the COVID disaster that's going on right now is a very expensive budget item for us, but we're doing it because it's important.
Thank you. Suzanne, would you like to ask your question? Suzanne Hamner.
My question relates to the attempt to cover, quote, all sides of an issue, or at least to give a balanced view of an issue. And that can lead to a few scientists who hold a minority opinion on something like climate change, getting as much space, or getting space that approaches what is being given to the scientists who hold a consensus view, overwhelming view from another vantage point. How is the way to handle that kind of situation?
I think we have to give more coverage, and we have to weigh the balance towards the legitimate science. There's no way that we can or should be trying to give even coverage to people who deny climate science to those who support or are on the legitimate side of climate science. We have included criticism, and that's the politicization of it, of people who say that, well, no, it's not the fossil fuel industries, it's other factors that are causing these things. There's practically no scientists now arguing that this is a cyclical, naturally occurring thing. The amount of information that's coming in that supports the fact that the argument that this is man-made, it's not an argument, it's a finding, that it's man-made, driven by industries, fossil fuel burning industries, is affecting the currents in the water, and that's affecting the distribution of heat in the atmosphere. The amount of scientific data that's supporting all this is overwhelming. It's huge. Whereas the amount of new research and data that's supporting the denying side is minuscule. It's really disappearing. It would be almost as if we said, well, we need to do even-handed coverage between the tobacco companies and those who have found that tobacco causes cancer. It became clear after a very short period of time that the tobacco companies did not have science on their side, and that they were harming the public. And the coverage drifted over to the right side, to the side that was properly telling you the truth.
What if the issue is political? What if it has to do, say, with the election? How do you handle it there?
Well, that happened. That happened in the last two elections, and we had to put on the various Trump speeches along with his opponent's speeches. We had at one point in the COVID discussion at the White House towards the end of the Trump administration, I forget the fellow's name. They brought in a scientist who was contradicting everything that Dr. Fauci was saying and everything the CDC was saying.
Scott Atlas.
Yeah, exactly. And there he was at the podium at the press briefing room at the White House, telling us stuff that was practically nonsensical. And we did have to report that they were doing that, but we reported it in context, that there was no scientific support for him, that the CDC didn't agree with him, that that Fauci and others were struggling to coexist with this stuff in the same White House, but that there was no scientific support for what he was saying. So that the context that we provide around someone like that who's denying the truth and denying the science is really important. It's up to us to put that into the context so that you can understand that we found that there's nothing to support the kind of stuff he was saying.
Thank you, Al. I'm going to skip around a little bit in the questions just so we have some variety, more variety of answers. Derek Jackson, you have sort of a comment here, but do you want to give it yourself or should I read it?
Sure. Hi, Al. Thanks for your really thorough rundown, your analysis of what's going on. The issue of, quote, diversity in the newsroom.
The what? Sorry?
Diversity in the newsroom.
Yes.
This is now, we're more than half a century since the Kerner Commission report in 1969. And in many ways, while there's been some, fair amount of progress, there's also been a massive stagnation. And to this day, less than about 13% of newsroom leadership in newspapers is of color, where it's 40, the nation is more than 40% of color at this point. Newsroom, both newspapers and television stations and have talked the talk of diversity in terms of numbers. How long do you honestly think it will take for the sort of the dam of diversity to become truly equity and inclusion in leadership positions and people covering what they want to cover and not being pigeonholed?
Oh, that's a mouthful. Let me just talk about my own experience. I mean, when I came to work at CBS News, it was a citadel of white male management, newsroom, editorial, management positions were all pretty much handled by white males. It was news. It was a major exception for a woman to break in, and if a woman did break in, it was almost always a white woman. We have gone through a very painful, difficult, slow, tortured process of diversifying. And the easiest place to diversify, of course, is at the lower levels, the entry levels. The hardest thing and the longest thing to transform are your senior positions and your leadership and your management levels. We have accomplished a certain amount of that at CBS News, but it's been a real struggle. It has not come naturally, it has not come easily. People left to their own devices tend to choose people like themselves in leadership positions. And that's what I've found. And for us to move beyond that has taken a lot of internal introspection. It hasn't come about naturally. It's been forced and almost required for the organization to transform itself. And I would put CBS News ahead of several other large news organizations in terms of diversifying, and we still haven't accomplished it at the very top. We're still working on it. I think it's something that's going to be going on for decades more. It's at some organizations, and it's got to be something that's got to be worked into your institutions so that you have more diverse voices, not just around the editorial table, deciding what's going to be on the evening news this week or what's going to be on a particular broadcast, but it really has to go all the way up to almost the corporate leadership levels. I can tell you that it's the data doesn't lie. And I think you're right. The data will show that in most news organizations, media organizations in this country, the diversification goes only up so far, and really peters out at the higher levels. You're down to like 3%, 4% diversity in the senior levels of an organization like CBS News, and probably less at other media news organizations. So it's a slow struggle. It's an important struggle, and it's something that's got to change. We have more African American and Hispanic senior managers in news than we've ever had before at CBS. We have minority who are executive producers, senior producers, vice presidents. But it's taken us a long time to get there, and we still have quite a ways to go. I don't have an easy answer for you, but it's an important thing, because how we cover something like the Black Lives Matter movement is greatly influenced by the amount of diversity that we have in our own ranks. And I remember, as I said, when I first came into CBS 43 years ago, I was the only Hispanic in the room. I mean, there was no, there were very few African Americans in the room who were in any position other than entry-level positions. But the transformation is taking place, and you just got to keep working on it. Got to keep working on it.
Thank you. Thank you, Al.
Can't give up. Can't stop that.
Nope.
I think we're going to do one more question by a new member, by Eric Grunbaum. Eric, please ask your question.
Thank you. Great conversation. I appreciate it. You said speeding the drift of news towards facts, I think, and science, and mentioned tobacco and climate. And I wonder if there isn't a way to create almost like a bond rating agency that rates news organizations on their history of factual reporting over, longer period of time, so that we actually have some way to rank news organizations when they're displayed on social media, where a startup in Central Europe could start putting out news, fake news in very short order, and would be posted at the same level as CBS, NBC, or New York Times. So some way to have a consortium of news organizations that agree on some basic fact-checking criteria, and then have news organizations rated in effect on their history, and also their retraction of mistakes or correction of mistakes.
Well, there are small news organizations that try to rate the accuracy of news organizations, but even they tend to post their own political point of view, things like Media Watch and things like that. I don't know who would be the arbiter of the ranking in what you suggest. The thought that you would have some independent body rating the reputation, the respectability, the fairness, the accuracy of news organizations over a long period of time. I don't know who would be part of that, what the criteria would be, And I think it's unrealistic to think that there can be any kind of governing body or professional body that can do that. We have professional bodies, obviously, that in journalism, but and we recognize each other's work when it's truly of merit and dealing with difficult situations. But what you want to do is you got to keep government out of that process. I remember a time when the United Nations, UNESCO, wanted to create something called the New World Information Order, where UNESCO was going to decide what were the truly independent and fair and truthful news organizations around the world. And this quickly degenerated into basically totalitarian governments wanting to determine what news organizations they were going to allow and which ones they were going to forbid in their territories. It's human beings aren't very good at that. I think that it really is the responsibility of consumers, people who are reading and watching the news, to reward the people who are most fair and most conscientious about trying to bring you unbiased news, or news that's balanced. All news, you can say, is biased, but balanced news. And for that reason, I think it is the job of the professionals, and I believe it's the job of people who watch the news and consume the news to do it as intelligently and as fairly and as broadly as possible, so that you can make your own decisions. That's the best. The only way that it's going to work. It's remarkable how few countries have legal protections for freedom of the press. It really is. And in this country, even though we have the First Amendment, we're in court all the time fighting to protect it, fighting challenges against it. And it is not something that is respected by all political parties. It's not something that's respected by commercial organizations. There's plenty of efforts by big companies, such as big tobacco, such as big energy companies, to threaten lawsuits against coverage that they consider to be defamatory. That's one way of trying to affect news coverage. And we have to, we're in this field where we've got a lot of critics telling us that, we're being unfair and we're working against someone's commercial interest. To me, it's a matter of conscience for journalistic professionals, but it's really a matter of news consumers being smart about what they choose and who they support with by their own viewing habits and reading habits.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we need to bring this to a close because it's dinner time.
I'm good for a couple hours, but you guys probably have other things to do.
Well, maybe what we'll do is we'll release those that want to go have dinner.
Yeah.
But and I apologize to all of, there are many great questions in the chat that we didn't get to, but when we did a survey last November, people said they wanted to be free at 7:15. So I think I better liberate the crowd. Al, thank you so much for speaking to us tonight and for your commitment to the truth and presenting a balanced view to the American public. Yeah, it's been a fabulous program and we were honored to have you speak. I want to thank our Moot awardees once again, Shanawaz Fakir and Faith Rounds, for their extraordinary work. We'll be watching you. We're excited about your futures. And I think everybody knows this, but in case you don't, thanks to the generosity of this group, each of these awardees has been given a check for $5,000.
Oh, wow.
So go awardees, and go Cambridge Club. Everybody have a great summer, be well, and we look forward to seeing you in person at our next October meeting. So again, thanks to everybody. Thank you, Al, and
Thank you. And thanks for the great questions. Appreciate the great questions.
thank you. Good night.